So, hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Caitlin, and I'm a wellness ambassador at Winter Park. I first want to shout out Guadalupe and Maria. They are the team behind our event today. And today we are here to talk about our spiritual dimension with some of our lovely professors here at Valencia. So I will let them introduce themselves, and then we will go into the questions.
Vishma, you go.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Bhishma Kunu, and I teach at Valencia College. I am regularly teaching Asian humanities, introduction to humanities, and world religions. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to teach a course specifically on Buddhism, which is my area of specialization. And that's a rare pleasure.
Hi everyone, I'm Chris Brown. I teach English 1 and 2, and I'm the Writing Center Director here at Valencia. And my background is in rhetoric, which is how language and symbols persuade us. And my background is Potawatomi, so I'll be speaking from a Native American spirituality perspective, as well as sort of a pan-Christian perspective, because I was raised sort of in both worlds growing up.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Paul Chapman. I teach humanities courses and our peace studies course here at the college. I'm kind of a wanderer. I wander around and I try to find, the value, the richness, the beauty, and all of these different traditions, and just, learn from them, to be quite honest. I have a mixture of traditions in my background: Jewish, Christian, mostly Protestant, some Catholic. But I also have members of my family who are completely atheist, who are pagan, who are kind of just spiritual, kind of the theme of this. So I do teach a mythology class in my humanities duties. So that's why I'm really happy to be here to talk about some of these things. Thank you.
Amazing, awesome. Okay, so from there, I'm going to go into question 1, and I think we can just go around in the order that we went around, and then we'll answer them question by question. So number 1, in the studies that you have done, what spiritual practice do you see is overlooked?
Okay, so I go first. All right, so to answer this question, I thought of 3 things, and I don't know if it'll intersect with what Professor Brown and Professor Chapman have in mind, but I'd say for me, the first one that came to mind is pilgrimage. I have spent so much time in academia, and rarely, I think, have I encountered the opportunity to study pilgrimage unless it was a deliberate attempt on the part of the professor. So I think pilgrimage is really significant because in some cases with specific world religions, it's embedded into the very framework of the religion. And the first one that comes to mind is Islam, right, with Hajj. The practice of going on a deliberate pilgrimage to Mecca is one of the 5 pillars of the practice itself. However, I think, looking at the history of religions, I feel as though pilgrimage appears in a number of religions, Christianity in the Middle Ages, with people going on pilgrimage to different churches, cathedrals, housing relics that were important to them, either as part of the fulfillment of some kind of vow or wanting to go pray for a specific thing at that specific place. But I think it's very easy to overlook all that's involved in actually going on a pilgrimage in the absence of things like air travel. So journeying to a place intentionally and making the sacrifice to go on foot requires a significant amount of discipline. Sometimes it also involves fasting, and it's a whole world unto itself. And I think it's a very deeply personal thing that's very often overlooked, in traditions where it's not a specific explicit part of the framework of the religion. So I have other ideas, but I'll let Professors Brown and Chapman answer first.
So I will just go out on a limb and say that I don't really know how many Native voices are represented in Valencia courses. And that's generally because Native Americans and Indigenous voices are placed sort of in this first chapter of the humanities book or the first chapter of a religions book as if it's sort of ancient, it's in the past. There's actually a trope called the disappearing native, right? Where native cultures are slowly ebbing away. So they represent sort of an early form of religion. And that's not how we as professors think of it. It's just how it's often structured. So because of that, the perspectives I often see on native voices is that they're pretty simplified. And there were thousands of tribes. There still are many hundreds of tribes here in the US. So these cultures do have similarities. And when I speak, I'm speaking from a Potawatomi perspective. My elders Choctaw. And there are certainly things that connect us all together in sort of an intertribal way. But even then, we're using our own family's histories, what my grandmother has told me, what my elders have told me, and not a lot of it is written. Most native cultures were completely oral cultures, oral traditions, except for in terms of trade, where they had lots of written language and number systems and all sorts of complex forms of communication between tribes. So the overlooked part, I would also say, is indigenous cultures around the world that are being and have been mistreated by larger world religions. And I would say then further non-Western cultures, at least here in our country, are overlooked often, or pretty much anything that doesn't fit into what we call like the big three or big four of the major world religions. And this is just because of my perspective. There's actually lots of smaller religions, even smaller groups of people who believe things that are not represented in textbooks at all. So this is just from the way I see it from where I sit.
Those are both good starts, honestly. Hopefully whoever's going to watch, and even just us here, it's good stuff to start thinking about. Something that I kind of think is overlooked, and maybe this just has to do with, especially in this country, but of course you can move to other countries and find that, but just the pace of life kind of keeps us and almost gives us an excuse to not have a spiritual practice. So, I think what's happened in the last 6 months with this pandemic is I hear a lot of people saying they're learning how to start slowing down. They're learning how to breathe and pay attention to what's going on in them. And honestly, that may even be causing some, more sort of or awareness of mental health needs that they have, right? Because I hear that our mental health crisis is going up too. But for me, something that's overlooked is taking the time for yourself. Spiritual practice is sometimes defined as a very independent practice that still, recognizes something other or more. But Vishma, you mentioned Islam. They pause 5 times a day. At least that's the, one of the pillars, right? To pause 5 times a day and just for, a few minutes at least, recenter yourself. But I don't think that's as encouraged as much in just general populations, whether or not you're in a faith tradition. I just get, from what I see, I just think that people don't do that. So enough for themselves, right? They overlook what their own body and what their own sort of mind and spirit is telling them that they need to do. And we get too busy and off we go. I call it a daily peace practice, but obviously for our purposes, I'll call it a daily spiritual practice. For what we're trying to define here. I have some other ideas, but I'll pause there.
Thank you. That was actually really fantastic. I love all of the different views that you guys have. Thank you for that. Okay, so we're going to go into question 2. So in the view of Scholar, why do you think the spiritual dimension is important?
Let me unmute myself first. So I struggled with answering this question from a purely scholarly standpoint, because I think for me this is it's very blended. When we think about what's considered spiritual, I think the first route that I would take with this one is the contrast, or the complement rather, that a spiritual practice brings to the materialism of the everyday world. I think it's very important to not only study academically, but also to have a spiritual practice in one's daily life because of the overwhelming amount of distractions. In Hinduism, for example, and also Buddhism, actually the majority of Indian traditions, they subscribe to a cycle of reincarnation, right, called samsara. And the actual technical term makes me think of a whirlpool, kind of like being stuck in a current, if you've ever been stuck in a current in an ocean. And that's kind of what daily life is like. You wake up, you kind of go through the motions, you do the same thing, different day, right? And there are so many currents in the world that can kind of grasp us and really, dig deep into us, like social media, or maybe patterns in the news, or representations in the news of particular people that are considered other. And there are so many currents. So I think spirituality is really a very potent way to go against the current, in a sense, to kind of go against the grain of materialism, egoism, and also the distractions. Going back to what Professor Chapman mentioned with pausing, a daily peace practice, or just pausing to kind of pay attention to what's going on. If we're going to call that a spiritual practice in some way, that can be, it's a very simple way to kind of just go against the current of what's happening and swirling all around you. That's really easy to kind of just sweep you off your feet, so to speak. And days go by and you don't even know what you've missed.
Just like Professor Kunu said, there's a materialism in the world, and there's this blendedness when you go outside of Western traditions between the spiritual and the physical, or the spiritual and the material world. At least in our practices for our tribe, the natural world is the spiritual world. So it's not as simple as like Pocahontas maybe makes it seem, where like everything's alive, that everything is connected in Native traditions. So because of this, every practice is spiritual. Everything you do has a spiritual attachment or connection to it. And that may seem like we're making trivial decisions very important, but if you think of like a native world where everything you do affects everyone else because you live in a small community, everything you do to the land affects the food you eat, everything you do to the water affects every person and every animal you see. So this connectedness is what leads a lot of Native spiritualities. When we talk about science, let's say, as like maybe a counter to spirituality, although I would say most Native people probably don't see it that way. Science is a deeper way of understanding that connectedness, right? Science doesn't tell us what we should do, it tells us what we can do. So I think spirituality adds another dimension to like a scholarly pursuit, which is what should be done. And maybe that's a personal decision, maybe that's a family decision, a tribal decision, a cultural decision, a country's decision, right? It gets bigger and bigger. And now we live in a global world where our decisions really do affect each other all the way around the planet. So the spiritual dimension for me as a scholar, it really does affect my work. I see myself as a full person when I'm with students. And what that means is like reminding them that there are still Native people. We still teach and learn our traditions between each other. We still are working to help what we call Western cultures understand something that they are still actively working to destroy. So the spiritual dimension is a reminder that it's not all about what's most effective or most productive or most, those kinds of mindsets and goals are super Western and have only existed for since the Industrial Revolution. And that's not very long in the history of humanity, and it won't last much longer either because it is self-destructive in a lot of ways. It doesn't have a lot of shoulds, it doesn't have a lot of empathy or care to it. So the spiritual dimension is something that's returning very slowly to the fields of academia, I would say, but it's essential because it's also what allows us to get other people to care about those things, and to get other people on the side of real people in the world and not objects or ideas or concepts, but the living and breathing world that we're a part
of. So pardon me, I'm so used to just calling everybody by their first name. I didn't use Professor Kunu, which is relatively newly earned, or Professor Brown. So I'll do that from now on. It's an interesting question. You know, something that I think about, and there's a community in this, or an organization in this community called the Central Florida Free Thought Community. And every time I hear spiritual or religious, I always draw them in and try to bring them into, you know, this, my mind, but also if I'm in some kind of a discussion, to make sure that people that are not, don't think of themselves as spiritual, but they're more scientifically based, have a voice in all of this. And so I'm not necessarily part of that group, but still it makes me think about how they might value this planet, human beings, all that kind of stuff. So it's just one part of, if you're looking at this in a scholarly way, the idea is that, you know, we want to educate people in all these different ways of thinking, and to more deeply understand what this experience of being human is on this planet and what our responsibilities are. So even if you think that, you know, after you die, you're going to just become the, you know, food for the worms or the dust that, you know, the rest of the universe is made up of, to me, there's still some responsibility there, even in people that don't have a spiritual or religious tradition. If you try to understand it from their point of view, then, you know, maybe again, you'll be like, wow, that's completely different from what I think. But there's so much richness there. There's so much thought that's been put into it. You know, I need to educate myself on what all of these other people think. And, you know, from animistic traditions, right? Chris, you know, talking about that a little bit, to, you know, monotheistic, polytheistic. I mean, there's so many different ways, you know, to explore this experience of being human. And again, what our relationship is to everything else. We need scholars to help us do that. And then something else that it made me think of is Viktor Frankl. I think it was him. He had this little equation that he used, and it was from his experience in the Holocaust, but he had this equation, D equals S minus M. And what he means by it is despair equals suffering without meaning. And if we're looking into all of these different traditions and the richness and just the beauty that they have, as well as, you know, things where I personally may not agree, but, you know, I try to look at the beauty of them. We need meaning. We need meaning, right? We need purpose and meaning. I even heard a man say the other day, it's more important than food for some cultures, right? You have to understand why you're here and what you're supposed to do, right? What your role is, what your responsibility is, and you can decide that for yourself, or you can, you know, join a group and have them help you understand what that is, you know. So scholars, I think, help educate all of us. They do the studies, they bring this information to us, and if we're open to it, my mom always says, have an open heart, open mind, then you'll get something out of it, you know. Okay, I'll pause.
Thank you, guys. So I'm going to move on to question 3. So in your studies of people, how have you observed people connecting to spirituality? This can be an interesting ritual or something day to day, or just something that you personally find interesting about spirituality, or maybe about a group that you guys have studied, or different things within your studies.
I think I've personally observed people connecting spiritually in many, many different ways. So to narrow it down, I'll just speak about a couple. So I grew up Hindu. You know, I was born into a Hindu household, and from a very young age, I would say the very first practice that I was taught to kind of do on my own was to wake up early in the morning, and you undergo, you know, your regular bathing practice or whatever it is, and then you face east, the direction of the sun, and make a water offering in that direction while reciting mantras. And nowadays, you know, many of these old Sanskrit terms have made their way into our regular everyday English, like mantra and karma and all of that. But a mantra is something I normally have to explain to students in my classroom, you know, what it actually is. It's a set of sacred syllables that, at least according to ancient Indian thought, if pronounced correctly, is supposed to bring about a particular effect. It's kind of like a spell, you know. So I think, you know, that for me was very, very important and impactful. And also, you know, it aligns nicely and intersects with other traditions that I've studied that actually honor nature and place that at the center of their worldview. You know, Professor Brown, you mentioned your particular Native American tradition and the importance of nature in that context. And it's something that, you know, I find very, I guess, grounding in a sense, you know, like making an offering in the direction of the sun around which everything pretty much revolves, right? Literally. That's one. Another is the practice of engaging in contemplative practices. I'm personally interested in contemplative practices and meditation, and that is one way I see more and more people connecting spiritually these days. You know, if they want to disconnect from some kind of, you know, explicit label of a religious tradition, meditation is something people are doing, and that comes in a whole host of forms. You know, you name it, you can find it out there, whether you want visualization, whether you want some kind of bare bones breath based practice, whether you want to pray to somebody, whatever you want, you can find it. That's common. And Professor Chapman, you mentioned the practice of Muslims, you know, practitioners of Islam praying 5 times a day. I personally, you know, I've seen people trying to do that wherever I've lived in the United States, you know, people orienting their bodies towards Mecca and, you know, undergoing their purification practices and, you know, orienting their body in that direction and putting their foreheads down to the ground. That's really noteworthy. I mean, what a physical embodiment of submission that is, you know, to do that 5 times a day. And imagine what it does to your thinking, or even how you think about your schedule. If you're praying 5 times a day is what your day is oriented around, you know, it really kind of shakes up what your priorities are in a sense. Okay, so I'll pause there.
So thinking about daily priorities, I grew up in a non-denominational Christian church, and really you're looking forward to like getting to the holiday, right? To Easter or to the next end of the season. And as I got older, I started to realize that a lot of these holidays were built around pagan traditions, what we call now, but proto-Christian or pre-Christian ideas of when the seasons are changing. Like we're coming up to Halloween, right? And that was seen as when we remember the dead, because that's the day that the boundary between life and death is thinnest, because we're moving into winter, right? So there was this connection to nature even in the traditions I grew up in that I didn't really understand. And if you think back to tribal cultures, and this is true in an intertribal way, so for lots of different Native American cultures and indigenous cultures in general, you're really looking forward to work ending, the sun going down, and everyone spending time together, usually around the fire, playing drums and singing and moving. So when we talk about prayer in the Native tradition, there's a lot of meditation mixed into what we call like intertribal work now, and spending time in quiet. But really the daily practice is dance, and dance is considered a kind of prayer. And another example of this is in the way that tobacco is used now, right? Tobacco is smoked by anybody, but I'm actually not allowed, or at least I don't allow myself to smoke tobacco, because when you do it, you're supposed to remember the needs of the community. And that is the way that the prayer circle, the dance circle, the drum circle are seen too. That's the moment where the community comes together and actually, we're not doing active work unless we're changing the rhythm or changing the song. And in Native cultures, the songs were able to change quickly. Ownership over language and songs, different than the Hindu tradition and a lot of traditions. It's not about the exact syllables or the exact words you use. It's about the feeling and the movement. It's about the teamwork and the cooperation. And when you're if you ever want to go to a powwow, they're open to everybody. And Florida has a lot of intertribal powwows. You should go. There's one in just around like Mount Dora area that happens twice a year. It's amazing. You get a sense of that, a sense of being a part of something bigger than yourself. This is part of my practice, but I also, in a very global way, I practice yoga every day. That's the way I move my body, to make sure that my breath is connected to what I'm doing. And other than that, I mean, there's really simple traditions that I learned when I was a kid. So for instance, you take sage and you burn it and you think about all the good things that you can do for the world and that the world does for you. Practice gratitude. These are the things I learned since I was a kid. But then maybe in the more esoteric way, or maybe in the more unique way, I also think about animals and plants and how they enter and leave my life in different ways as very personal and meaningful too. So this might be something that you don't know a lot about, but for instance, if you see an animal in a medicine way, is what we call it, that means that the animal is bringing you some kind of message. So there are hawks all day in Florida around you all the time. But when a hawk lands just outside your window and is looking in, he is a messenger. He's trying to remind you of something, perhaps that there's something to remember, something you need to take somewhere else. So this might seem to people outside of the tradition as something that isn't possible for them to believe in. But I think my elder would probably say it best. It's really not about if you believe that the hawk is actually a messenger. It's about if you're going to take the time to make the appearance of the hawk part of your ritual. So it's like noticing the world around you and either realizing it in a way that is good and beautiful and helpful for you, or not. Maybe it reminds you of other things too. So the same thing in the prayer circle or in the dance circle. You can be reminded of the troubles that you need to work through, and the dance might be very intense for you, or it might be very cathartic and relaxing. And everybody's kind of going through something a little bit different. But even when I'm dancing somewhere outside of the circle, maybe just in my living room, I still have those moments of catharsis, those moments of finding peace in the actual using my body against the drum of the earth, is what I would say.
Professor Brown, I have a story that I want to share when we get to the next question that is related to what you just said. But I want to start from the personal just for a moment. I did not grow up with any organized religion. It was just something that we stepped into once in a while. So I had a grandfather who was Jewish. So every once in a while, you know, a little conversation would start about that. We did go to a Presbyterian church when I was little, but that stopped pretty quickly because of my dad's and our family really, my dad's professions that we all needed to help out with. And Sunday just wasn't a day where we could go to church because we all helped with his business. So I grew up with routine rather than ritual. But I yearned for ritual. I wanted to understand what other people were doing because it just seemed so, again, so moving and important and sacred and all those types of things. So I loved watching shows, you know, that took me to other parts of the world and showed me what other people did. I've taken that, for example, in my mythology class, we have a discussion area and there's questions that I give them, but there is a space for just exploring the world around you and posting things that you find. What kind of rituals do people do, right? So can I share my screen? I think I have the ability. So I want to, or if somebody can give me that ability. I'll talk about something else too. Oh, there we go. Okay. So here's something that I found that I put up on our discussion board. But this is from, you might call it Persia. I have a friend who's from what we would call on the map Iran, but she prefers to be called a Persian or from Persia. But look at this beautiful ritual. The newborn babies, when they experience their first spring, they are held in these blankets, and it's almost like a little swing that they create. This picture doesn't show it, but there is a video up here that I give to the students. But they shower them with these beautiful flower petals, right? To welcome them in. They're the new life, you know, we're in spring. It's a connection to the celestial events that, you know, we're all a part of. It's just beautiful stuff. So I like getting my students to explore the world around them and find these unique celebrations and rituals. You know, we talk about it. It's, you know, the 4 basic ones are birth, you know, coming of age stuff, marriage and death, but there's healing rituals, there are rituals, peace rituals. I mean, there's rituals again, like celestial events. We just had our fall equinox, right? Yesterday, it was yesterday. So there are events around that that I just find so fascinating, and they deepen my humanity, right? If I see that other people are paying attention, like Chris, or sorry, Professor Brown, like you said, you know, it doesn't have to be some kind of like immediate spiritual meaning to it. It's just, did it get you to pay attention to something that, you know, breathe a little bit more, something like that, right? That's beautifully said. You know, witnessing different rituals has been interesting. And again, I mentioned that my family has a mixture of beliefs and philosophies. So I have a sister who lives in Texas, but she's full-blown pagan. So she went through, it was a couple years ago, but she went through her crone ceremony, which is, you know, you go from the maiden to the mother to the crone for female. And again, there's a whole nother area that we could talk about just as far as gender and rituals around gender and the blending and the sort of transition and, you know, the blurring of lines between gender that cultures have done around this world forever. Hey, there's your cat. So she did a crone ceremony. For men, it's, you know, the young man, the father, and then they call it a senex, which is like the wise old man figure. So I share that with my mythology class. There's this beautiful ritual, and what I'm hoping, there's a lot of, you know, people from Christian or monotheistic traditions that have a very negative view of pagan traditions and rituals because they use, you know, objects like a knife in some of their rituals, right? But you can find that in, you know, more established world religions as well, whether it's Sikhs or Sikhs actually is how they pronounce it, or, you know, they have swords and different things. So I share that ritual with the class, and then it leads us into, you know, and this maybe goes back to the first question in a different way, but just, you know, spiritual practices, but also just spiritual, well, practices, but that we'd overlook, or that we, you know, kind of negatively stigmatize or something like that. So there's just so much beauty out there in ritual, I find. So I'll pause there.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I love that you brought paganism into it, because I feel like we don't hear a lot of that, as well as Professor Brown and your views on Native American, and Professor Kunu, did I pronounce that correctly? Okay, awesome. And your views on Hinduism and the Indian tradition. I absolutely love it. Okay, so we have one last question, and this one's a little bit more personal. So how do you personally connect to the spiritual dimension?
Well, I'm going to shake things up and have Professor Chapman answer first.
Happy to, Professor Kunu. We'll go backwards this time. Not backwards, we'll just go a different direction. How about that? Well, I have, you know, Professor Brown, you mentioned that you have elders, you know, teachers that are around you. Again, not having really participated in any organized religion, you know, I kind of had to find my own way. And my parents were supportive of that, you know, just here's some basic, you know, ways of treating people. Let's adhere to these. There, you know, never was a racist word spoken in my house or anything like that, homophobic. So, you know, not to say that I didn't pick those things up, because you grow up in a society that did have those kind of things in place. And so, you know, I had to check myself through the years, but I did have teachers, and I consider my mother one of those teachers. I mean, she has a daily spiritual practice where she sits as the sun is coming up. You mentioned the east, you know, facing the east. She sits in the morning as the sun is coming up, and there's oh my God, I wish I could show you all. It's this picture from the late 70s that, you know, when I was a child and I had older brothers and sisters, they organized us all and we went and took a family portrait for my parents. So it still hangs on the wall. So she sits every morning and looks at that and goes through every single one of us and sends the best energy, the best intentions. You know, she does believe in God, so she sends that, you know, blessing or whatever it is on us. So I would, you know, hear her saying that she does that every morning. And so I picked up that kind of a practice from her. But again, being kind of a wanderer, not meaning that I'm lost, but that I like to wander around and visit all these different traditions and learn, you know, what I can, the things that really deeply move me or inform me. I adopt those, right? So that's important. And I've had, my sister, I just mentioned my sister in Texas. I mean, her perfect, her idea of a perfect night, she's not so much with the sun, she's more a moon person. So her perfect day would be going out. She has about 2 acres of property, going out, and it's so beautiful. She's created little areas in that property. She has a moon garden. She has a sort of a spot for a fireplace where people sit and, have, community. My dad went one time, she made a little golf putting green out in the area for him. So she has different spaces that she's created for herself. So her perfect, day would be to moonbathe. So there's a respect for nature. There's a respect for the trees and the plants and, the air and the water that she gives to me. And then again, I have a brother who's much more Christian in that tradition. I have a sister that's much more atheist. I have other sisters. I have 5, by the way, 5 sisters, 2 brothers that, have their own sort of individual perspectives, don't necessarily go to anything organized. So I have all this, richness. And, again, being in education, of course, that is my job, to investigate and, help bring this information back to students in the class. So, Chris, I want to mention this, sorry, Professor Brown, I want to mention this story really quick. My dad recently passed just a couple weeks ago after quite a long battle with dementia and all these complications that come with it. So I had to go pick up his ashes. He wanted to be cremated. And I went to, it's right down the road from here, it's up in Maitland. Went to the funeral home to pick up his ashes, and as soon as I pulled in, I got out of my car and an osprey swooped in and started circling around right above me. Not uncommon, so I didn't think much of it. I live by a lake, I see them all the time, okay? Also, there was a nest across the street. I pick up his ashes, bring him out to the car, drive to where my mom lives. She lives in an assisted living facility now. I drive in, as soon as I park and open my door, another bird of prey swoops in and lands on a column right next to the parking spot that I'm at. Okay, got my attention. I didn't think I was going to be able to take the ashes back to my mom in her apartment because they're under some protocols for COVID. They said, no, you can go in. Just go around the back and we'll open the door for you and go in. I drive around the back, park my car, about to get out, and another bird of prey swoops in and lands on a column right next to me. And here I am, with my dad's ashes in my arms saying, I got you, Dad, I'm going to take you in, taking you back to Mom. And again, what she just said was beautiful. Even if I'm kind of a scientifically minded person, there's something that I can get from that. And for me personally, I'm okay with mystery. I don't necessarily have to have the exact meaning of for what that was, but it was beautiful and very comforting. I'll pause there.
I'll just pick up there, and Professor Cooney, you're welcome to go next if you like. I'll pick up there and just say that in most Native traditions in the Americas, the word for God is sometimes translated as like the Mother Nature and things like that. But the actual in our languages, it's generally the Great Mystery. And when we look toward spirituality, God, meaning in greater things, it's because the mystery has guided us to look in those places. It doesn't tell us what these 3 birds mean. It tells us to look toward them, and maybe you'll find some peace. And especially the osprey, and then the birds of prey. It's like a message of grace. Sometimes it can be something as simple as just knowing 2 words, and that it's okay for it to be a mystery, for it to be meaningful still. Professor Cooney, you want to go first? You want to go next? You want me to keep going?
Please.
Okay. So in a similar way, I'm very open to different traditions. And, we talked a little bit before about Halloween, and I definitely think about the moon and the way it affects people. My grandmother worked as a director of nurses, and she would tell me that the patients, no matter where she was, they would have wild incidents on the full moon, right? And this is not something that we don't know about. We have plenty of scientific data that shows that we're affected by the movement of the planet and the movement of a giant thing that used to be a part of our planet that's right, very close to us. It makes sense that these have real physical effects on us. So when I was in college, I went to Casadega for the first time. And this is about an hour away. It's a spiritualist settlement that started 70, 80 years ago during the spiritualist movement in the United States. Spiritualism in this context means people who were connected with the dead, who said that they could read signs and symbols. And I had a significant experience there, and I'll save you all the details of it. But basically, someone did like a one-off reading where they just said whatever came to mind about a friend and I, and we're part of a big tour group. And we were the ones that had this one-off reading happen to us. It was very significant to me. It was like, how could this person know these details about me and about my friend and about what we share in common? And it keyed me into that there was something else, another way of communicating with people and with the world that isn't as direct as the Western tradition and even the way we use language today is. So I read tarot cards. I've done it professionally for about 8 or 9 years now. And that is a strictly pagan tradition. But the way I see it is that I am, not that I'm reading the future or that I'm learning, or that even that I'm doing some kind of mind trick where I learn about the person. Instead, the person and I pick the cards together, and then I tell them what the cards mean. And they see the cards as we pick them. So they are picking cards that have symbols on them that appeal to them or that are interesting to them, or maybe that just hit them in some way. And I just explain what the card means in the tradition. So it's more like a reflective surface between us. And sometimes they'll give me information and we'll talk about that and connect it to the card. But what I've seen in doing readings like this is that there is a single arc of the human experience. You can be from any culture around the world, any age. You can be anywhere on any spectrum you can imagine, and there's still parts of the human experience that don't change. And we've hinted on some of that like core of the human experience and everybody's responses here. I think that that's what, when we leave here, we'll remember too, is not the particularity maybe of the meaning of this one bird to me, Chris Brown, but maybe the idea that you can find meaning in those things. So I try to take that with me to other people. And then in my comp classes, the way I practice my spirituality there, which I think is actually quite important because there are not a lot of practicing native voices at the college or at any college, to be fair. I show them native voices that we have recorded, meaning like speeches that Native Americans gave in the 1800s and later. And then we talk about how those voices were distorted, how white authors took those voices, printed them in new ways, added words to them. We talk about the translation process and how parts were forgotten or omitted or stigmatized. We talk about how even sometimes they're making fun of the native person by changing the language they used or what they said. And this is sometimes disheartening for my students to like think like, oh, well, now there's no real information about Native Americans. There's just all these distorted or what we call whitewashed voices out there. So how do we know what's really Native American? And my answer to that is something like, well, here we are. There's not going to be a Native Bible that tells you what Native Americans are like. There's not going to be a spokesperson for every Native person. I'm certainly not that, and neither any of the people I've talked about, my grandmother, my elders. So I, in that same way of sort of complicating their idea maybe, or even my own idea of what is sacred and what is true, it brings me peace because knowing we're all moving through this information together and that we're all trying to find the core of truth in it, or even what's true about this one native person from my tribe who spoke in 1850 before they took all the land away from our tribes, it helps me feel like we're connected in that discovery process. And that's spirituality for me, is being connected to others.
So I think this question is challenging also for me to answer because I was raised in very specific traditions, but for me personally, I think part of my drive to study religion academically is because of my innate curiosity about this mystery that Professor Brown spoke of and Professor Chapman alluded to. the mystery is very, very captivating, but I'm resistant to labels. I really struggle with it. I don't know where it comes from, but I struggle so deeply that, you know, I sort of just find myself confounded when people ask me what religion I am. So I think for me, in terms of a spiritual practice that I personally find rewarding, um, I would say that anything that gets me to experience something extraordinary in the ordinary world does it for me. And that's a whole bunch of stuff without labels. But in actual practice, it's, I would say it looks like a lot of different things. It looks like um, reciting mantras. It looks like sitting and observing my breath, you know, trying to train myself to appreciate the present moment, which is where all of life is happening right now, you know, where everything cool is happening with nature right now. Sometimes it's in just on a daily basis expressing, I guess, a tremendous amount of gratitude. Having a regular gratitude practice, I think, allows me to experience the extraordinary in the ordinary. We're incredibly privileged. I mean, we live in 21st century America. We are among the most privileged people on this planet right now. Yet, I think we started this conversation speaking about mental health spikes, right? Issues. Issues. So, I don't know. That's really baffling to me. You know, especially when you travel to different places like Haiti or India and other developing countries, and you see people with so much less being able to give so much more and live with so much gratitude on a day-to-day basis. You know, how do you explain that? And here we are in 21st century America, and we are so deeply sick, medicated. So for me, anything that gets me at you know, encountering that mystery, being, you know, in awe. Yeah, that's it.
Can I add just a little bit to that? I would say medicated both with prescription drugs that are deemed illegal, drugs that I don't think are even really harmful, but are still maybe deemed illegal. But yeah, there's.
Did you freeze, Professor Chapman? Did anybody experience that? Okay, just wanted to make sure. I think you froze. We cut out. You were talking about medicated prescription and non-prescription.
And illegal drugs.
Yeah. Sorry, my internet sometimes go out. Well, what I wanted to say is some people use the natural plants of this planet for healing and for, you know, entering into spaces that give them a greater understanding of what this is all about. There are places right here in our community that do ayahuasca ceremonies, sweat lodge ceremonies, frog poison. I mean, you name it. There are people that use this, again, not to cover up, you know, whatever issues they've had or, you know, to ignore their traumas, but to open themselves up and, you know, again, just to heal and to create more connection with people. So there's that whole, you know, side of it too. And again, I think there are too many people that are in our 21st century America, right? Having mental health issues, even though everything is around them, right? It's the abundance around them, and they, for whatever reason, but, you know, getting back to what spiritualism is, it's a focus on the non-material. It's getting away from material things and trying to find meaning through that and refocusing, like with your breath or just with your, you know, attention to the other person's you know, the humanity, the common ground we stand on, those types of things. So I appreciate you saying that, Dr. Canoe and Dr. Brown.
Yes, Professor. I would just add too that it was illegal until the late 1970s to practice native religions, native spiritual practices. There's lots of reasons for that, but you can imagine that there is a blossoming pharmaceutical industry in the late 1970s. There are lots of focuses on making more plastic and more disposable and more fast everything. And if you deeply consider in a spiritual way a lot of these contemporary practices, which really have come from the Industrial Revolution, which we're still in, it makes sense that you wouldn't, as a industrial society, it would not benefit the society to deeply consider the way that you're poisoning the land, or the way we're poisoning each other, or the way we're creating and sustaining addictions that are eventually violent and harmful. So, balance in all things, and there's a place for all people, I believe, and all sorts of medicines. But there definitely is a set of forces in society that is constricting and constraining, even erasing cultures. So when we talk about spirituality, it's often like peacefulness and mindfulness. But for me, spirituality is also the spirit of the warrior. It is remembering what you're fighting for and who you're fighting for, and realizing in that you're guided by the people who came before you. I mean, we've said tradition a lot, but what that really means to me in my tradition is it's my ancestors who survived. I mean, the Trail of Tears, there's one plaque in the Native American Museum dedicated to the Potawatomi who died there, but they were marched from the Great Lakes to Oklahoma, and mostly women and children died, mostly of disease and starvation. These are real people to still fight for, to keep alive through our traditions. So when people have sort of a dismissive view of spirituality, it's really easy for me to fall into like this, oh, I need to educate, I need to provide context, I need to, but what I actually need to do is focus inward, and figure out where I can plug in and make meaning again. And that's the really hard part. I think a lot of spiritualities I encounter, a lot of religious traditions I encounter, are about doing things outwardly. And there's a lot of good service work to do in the world, to be fair. But so little of it now is focused inward that the connection between those two things, I think, is being lost.
Thank you guys. I really appreciate you guys joining us today. I do want to open up just a 5-10 minutes. If you guys have any resources that you would like to share right now, we do have a resource list going up on our social media of community resources as well as campus resources. And then we have some books and videos and just different things that have been collected by our wellness team at Winter Park as well as East Campus that we've kind of combined into a nice little list and some social media posting. But I would like to give you guys time to be able to share maybe some community resources or campus resources that you guys know of that students could reach out to, and maybe investigate further if they were interested in something that you guys talked about here today.
Gotta think about that. Anybody else want to go first?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is the physical space on various campuses that has been, opened up to students to come in and do whatever it is they need to in the privacy of that space. I don't know what it's called now, maybe an interfaith room or something like that. But I know when I was teaching on the West Campus, we had one there in Building 5. I'm aware of the space existing on East Campus, and at the downtown campus, the last I saw it, since we've been out because of COVID, the last I saw it, it was in the Union West building, which is our building where the student housing is. And we also have classrooms there. And I think it's on the 2nd or the 3rd floor. I could be mistaken, but it was still sort of under construction, but we have a room there as well for students to use.
I am aware that we do have a space on Winter Park campus as well. Marsha Roman, she runs her Koru meditation through those, or in that room as well when she runs those sessions. But we do have one upstairs It's just one building. So we have our room upstairs over by our answer center.
I would encourage any students who want to learn about Native tribes to go to the websites of the tribes. So for us, it's Citizen Potawatomi Nation, but just finding voices that are from the people that are still part of those cultures today is really important. If you want to sort of see how Native people talk to each other, you can look up the social distance powwow, which is a way of being at a powwow right now. But it's just a group of people, non-native and native, people who are just interested in the culture, connecting that way. Yeah, and I would say the other thing too is just pay attention to where your information's coming from, especially when you're looking at groups that have been systematically destroyed or groups that are not well represented where you're from. Because that's the biggest thing for me is I encounter lots of ideas about Native people that don't have any relationship to the actual people. So being connected to information that you know where it comes from is very important to me. So whatever it is, just make sure you know who's responsible for it.
Those are great examples of resources, places for students. We do have, like you said, Caitlin, we do have one on the Winter Park campus. You know, because of COVID, we're not doing this right now, but with the Peace and Justice Institute, we usually did about 2 faith tradition or philosophical, you know, thought tradition visits every semester. So again, we visited the Hindu Society of Central Florida, Islamic Society, Sikh Society. We've been to various Christian churches. Again, the Central Florida Free Thought community. So, you know, it just takes me back to my college days where I just sought out these different traditions, and I just went. I, you know, chanted with the Taoists. I meditated with the Buddhists. I, you know, stood up and kneeled with the Catholics, and you know, just did everything I could to not just read. Right, you have to do that, I think, or you know, watch videos or whatever it is, but then go out and you know, experience it as well. So, you know, for example, there's a couple of them around town, but a Unitarian Universalist church closer to downtown on Robinson and Hampton right in the corner. And they've been there for, I think, maybe just over 100 years. But something that they do, you know, we're coming up to these, you know, some of these major holidays, just, you know, Thanksgiving, this is just part of this country, or just this Christian one that's coming up, but there's Jewish holidays. So if there's any way that you can, you know, virtually participate in some of these things, I would do it. But, you know, there's more than just those. Like the Unitarian Church has a history with the Christian, you know, form of worship, but they also have members of the community that are pagan. They're welcome there, and they do like a Yule celebration, you know, every year that anybody is welcome to go and participate in. They sit up all night and they light this Yule log, and you know, they talk about these pagan traditions. It's just beautiful. So the variety and just the, I don't know, just the diversity of our religious community here and thought community is a resource. It's all around us. You know, it's predominantly Christian, but still, there's more than enough. That the Sikh community or Sikh community, I think it's out by Oviedo. It's not just the people that are here in this area. People from Daytona Beach that are Sikh or Sikh, they come to that place. There's like 400 or so, 400 or 500 people in this bigger Central Florida area that use that one space. And when we said we wanted to come and visit them, they were just ecstatic. I mean, they couldn't believe that their little community was going to be, you know, engaging with so many people from an educational institution. But we do invite, you know, people from the community to come on these things too. So it's all around us. Just go experience it.
And I have one other thing to add. This is just a shameless plug, but I mean, take a world religions course, you know. I've said it jokingly in the past to various deans, but I think this should just be required, really. You know, there's so much talk about diversity and inclusion, and one of the things I really love about teaching at Valencia, and I will just say it, I'll stand on top of the highest mountain and say it, is the diversity among our student body. I see it and I appreciate it, and it is a very abundant source of cultural capital that students can draw on and instructors can draw on, all of us can learn from. And I think religion is a really interesting lens to kind of access that diversity and kind of learn how to navigate that world, you know, with greater skill. So take a world religions course. It always, you know, astounds me when I see people using the word Muslim and Islam incorrectly, and, you know, throwing around terms from other religious traditions that that they don't know how to use properly, myself included. We're human, we're always learning. You can never stop learning. And I think, you know, world religions is a really good way to go about just understanding some of that and navigating what can be a very, very complex world. So it's Religion 2300, just in case anybody's interested.
Very good, Dr. Kanu. One more little thing. I encourage people to not be afraid. Religion, you know, faith traditions can be kind of intimidating. Somebody that I've had in my class for several years now, I invite her in, but it usually scares the deans, scares other faculty and students, but she is one of the leaders of the Church of Satan. Now there's the Satanic Temple and there's a Church of Satan. They're two different groups and they don't often get along. And just the word Satan is probably going to scare a lot of people, right? But students, I give them a lot of credit. The ones that are, you know, again, more involved in some of the major monotheistic traditions, they tell me they cannot do it. They don't want to be there. And then they have the courage to show up and they listen and they learn something, even if they don't want to be a part of that, of course, right? So, you know, that one maybe is for some people a little more intimidating than, you know, going to visit the Hindu Society of Central Florida, but have some courage, right? If you're willing to walk into that space, some of those misconceptions, some of those, you know, stereotypes can be broken down, and you can learn something, right? Even again, you don't have to be a part of it; just you can learn something.
I actually had a friend who was in your class, and she came back with all of her notes from that specific class where she came in and talked. She was like, because I was super, like, I was jealous. I was like, oh, I really wish I was there. But she gave me all of the information. She was like, oh, it was so cool. I learned so much. And I think it was fantastic that you brought in someone from the Church of Satan to talk to your class, just because that's so, you know, I don't think I took mythology, but that's very different from world religions. And we didn't go into anything that, like, you know, we went into that, but we didn't anyway. But I thought it was really cool that you brought in somebody to talk about that, because it's so taboo and it's so, you know, scary to somebody who's not open-minded.
Yeah, and that was my mythology class, and she was brought in to talk about, you know, her perspective, but also about rituals. We were trying to learn about rituals, and they have rituals. They're actually, I mean, from their description, they're actually atheists. They don't believe in gods, leprechauns, fairies. They go down the list. But they do appreciate community, ritual. There was one other one that, you know, they sort of borrow or appropriate from religious traditions that they see, wow, that's great. People get together, you know, common, you know, sort of goals and ideas. And so they appreciated that. But I almost did give my dean a heart attack when I told her who was coming in. So I give her credit for being okay with it.
Awesome. Okay. So I want to thank you guys again for coming and speaking from your knowledge and sharing it with us as well as these students. If there isn't anything else anyone else would like to add, I think we're going to go ahead and end the recording here. Oh, yes.
I have a little question. So first, I would like to thank all of you. I think this has been a beautiful, beautiful, and very rich conversation. So thank you for that. And I just have a question. So what do you think about like spiritual practices going trendy? For example, like yoga now, which has, it's a very ancient philosophical tradition, but it has suffered like the translation process into like the Western language, which speaks a lot of our like anthropologically about our society, but maybe not itself about yoga originally. How do you guys see that?
I'll just echo something that my elder said to me. So there was a commercial that came out with Johnny Depp. He's like up on a mountain in Utah, and he's dressed in a slightly native way, perhaps, or maybe like a Western way. And he goes up there, and there's a real native person up there fancy dancing. And then they tell you that the name of the cologne they're selling is Savage, which is basically savage with like an accent mark. So this is to me a kind of appropriation, right? They're using a word that is basically a cuss word that was used to like hunt and scalp native people to sell cologne. And I asked him what he thought about this, and he basically said, well, that's a real native person getting paid to fancy dance for the television. So my personal feelings are that I can't control if, you know, someone wears a headdress for Halloween. But I can remind a person that a headdress is the same thing as like a Purple Heart. It's like a mark of honor. Um, it's sort of like the idea of you pick and choose your battles, and you have to realize that cultures and traditions and symbols live on in new ways. And while I might not like agree with all those, I also can't control all of them. And I can't be like the native police, because that doesn't there's not much power in that. The idea of a native privilege to control native traditions, it's not real or possible. So, you know, do I dislike the name of the Redskins? Absolutely. But you know, the Seminoles, I mean, they're using like the name of an intertribal group called the Seminoles. So I can see, I guess, the give and take of this new world we live in. So I ask for balance in my own response to it too.
I would agree with Professor Brown. I'd say I I have criticized yoga specifically in America because of things like uh, in magazines like Prana, for example, that sell $80 pants to practice yoga in, when traditionally, you know, yoga was about renunciation of everything worldly. So there are some major explicit incongruencies, and I see them. But um, I think along the lines of what Professor Brown was saying, religious traditions or spiritual practices, they do transform, and there's also something encouraging about seeing a practice like yoga um, finding its way into American society, and finding people, young and old, seeing some sort of value in it. It may not be people sitting around, you know, meditating, trying to find their Atman and merging their Atman with their, you know, with the ultimate reality or something like that. But um, again, you know, if people are able to access something extraordinary in the ordinary, then I think it has its place. You know, I've heard people describe the practice of yoga and, you know, meditation for mental health, for example, you know, kind of absent of all of the other religious underpinnings that it comes with, or without the context of the larger religious tradition. Um, I've heard people describe that as very valuable in their daily lives. And what can be wrong with that if it helps to bring about a state of calm, ease, people feeling centered and grounded in their day-to-day experience, as opposed to being agitated, you know, and afflicted in some way. So I think it has its place. And I also had the same criticism of the practice of mindfulness. Um, if you're familiar with the Eightfold Path in Buddhism, you know, the Buddha's prescription for well-being, or how to achieve nirvana, essentially, you'd know that present moment awareness or mindfulness is just one of the limbs on that Eightfold Path. It's just one. And mental health professionals are comfortable with extracting, just that present moment awareness practice and plopping it into, some sort of prescription for a patient's well-being. So when you look at it through the lens of what the entire Buddhist tradition is about and how to go about achieving nirvana, sure, it looks like you're just focusing on one thing without paying attention to what right speech entails, or right thought, or right concentration, or right livelihood. What about all that other stuff, that makes it a whole integrated practice that's about, a human's well-being from the Buddhist standpoint. So it's easy to criticize it. But again, I think mindfulness practice, yes, it has been kind of, taken out of different Eastern traditions and reformulated for an American audience. But I hear countless testimonials, I guess, or testimonies that people are benefiting from it, and I can't really argue with that.
I don't have a lot to add to that. That was all beautifully said. And you all have a little more, honestly, a little more experience with things like yoga, meditation, those things that have transformed, right? Could be good, could have its negative qualities too. So I'll leave it there.
Any other questions? Okay, awesome. So I think we're good. Does anybody want to add anything else? No? Maybe?
Just to say thank you to all of you for organizing this. I think it was an excellent topic, and I appreciate you considering me as a panelist. And I thought your questions were excellent. It's hard to write a good question.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you all very much. And thank you for the wonderful conversation and connections.
Yeah, I the same thing. Thank you for inviting me. If you ever, have the opportunity to do this again, I would be more than happy to help out, because this helps me grow as well. I like to share what I've learned, but if I'm not hearing what other people think, I get a little bit lost. So I appreciate you setting this up.
I appreciate all of you guys coming into our space and talking about something that's sometimes uncomfortable to talk about. So I appreciate it. And I think that a lot of students are going to benefit from this. I know I definitely benefited from this. I learned some things that I don't think I quite was mindful about before. But yeah, so I really appreciate you guys coming and joining us today. Do we want to stop the recording and then awesome.